actually said exactly the same thing. That is, right now, we are buying time by introducing the aggressive monetary policy and sort of the large-scale fiscal policy. Just buying time. And during you buy time, we have to discuss or use them for the PT or the other micro-structural issue. Okay. So my concern is that I'm very good at one thing. Especially if you take a look at the kind of existing mood of the Fed from the current very relaxing monetary policy regime. I don't think the Japanese government has the long enough time to achieve the third R. So I mean, this is open question, and I'm going to work on this kind of stuff. But yeah, that'd be nice. Thank you very much.
So if you could hold your questions until the Q&A later after all the speakers do their respective lectures. So next up we'll have Professor Fujihira, who will be speaking on politics aspects.
Okay. Well, thank you for the invitation. Everyone has a handout, hopefully. Are you excited about Japanese politics?
Yes.
No. So I have 15 minutes to try to get you excited. And the first thing I would say is I'd like you to go back to August 30th, 2009. That is the date when the Democratic Party of Japan, DPJ, won the lower house election. In fact, won 308 seats, which is the largest number of seats that any political party's ever won in a lower house election. So 308 out of 480. And so on August 30th, 2009, if you had told anyone, including me, that in 3 years and 3 months, there will be LDP back in power, it'll be Prime Minister Abe, and Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister Aso, to paraphrase Steve Martin, many would have said, "What have you been smoking? And can you tell me where I can get it?" So in other words, what I want to do is to place. So I know the title, and I think is about Abe, but I want to do is to place this in a longer historical context in terms of where current Prime Minister Abe fits. And so these are the two photos, the first and second cabinets, and whoops, I didn't mean to block it out. I think it's downloaded. Sorry, I didn't. It was actually on there when I. But anyway, it's not bad. We'll have this photo. I don't know what happened there. But anyway, so we've had 7 prime ministers in the last. Maybe we'll get away from this slide. We'll go back to that. So what I want to do today is I'll just emphasize this one idea, which is the idea of electoral mandates. And so I define electoral mandate, very simple, very intuitive, as authority which voters in a democracy give to elected representatives to govern after an election. And so that's an electoral mandate, very simple. And my argument is that electoral mandates are shaped by 2 variables. One is institutional, and the other is what I would call ideological ambitions. And so by institutional, what I mean is that institutions, I'll define more precisely, decide, for example, how percentage of votes would translate into percentage of seats. Institutions, for example, shape the number of veto players that a prime minister faces. when she or he is trying to implement public policy. Ideological ambition, that is that elected leaders typically come with ideology. Ideology defined as a system of ideas which explain how the world is and also how the world should be. And so ideology always has a positivist as well as a normative element. Ideological ambitions often reflect personal backgrounds of political leaders and long-held beliefs. And they also tend to deviate from voter preferences. Ideological ambitions typically deviate from what voters say that they want at the time of the election. And they often also tend to be idiosyncratic, again, because they are personally held beliefs. So my argument is that when a politician becomes a prime minister, I'll just say he for now because we've only had he starts thinking about his personal glory, that he thinks that my time has come and I have changed Japan. There, I did it. Okay. And so I'll talk very briefly about 3 prime ministers, Koizumi, Hatoyama, and Abe, and then how that sort of played out. And so there we go. So obviously you needed to I meant no disrespect to the current prime minister. So this is the only slide that I will have some texts, and hopefully I'll be done with this in a minute. And so Japan has a parliamentary system. What it means is that the prime minister is not directly elected like a president. And what it also means is that what matters, at least one of the many things that matters, is a party presidential election. So who becomes president of the Liberal Democratic Party, LDP, who becomes president of DPJ, and so on. The other problem with Japan is that it has 2 houses, typically called lower house and upper house, which have 2 completely different electoral systems, and whose elections occur, for the most part, with different timing. And so one of the problems with Japan has been the sort of oft heard this term, Nijirekokai, or twisted diet. And that means that it's very difficult for a prime minister to have a majority in both houses, because both houses have almost equal, not entirely equal. The lower house still has more powers, for example, in terms of budgetary issues. But Japan's very unique in that sense. So it's not really about culture, for example, that you might point to. Institutionally, Japan's a very distinctive democracy. And one of the distinctiveness is bicameralism. So 2 chambers, bicameralism, in which both houses actually could be veto players in terms of what the prime minister wants to do. So I won't go into much detail. So what I did was I made a handout, which is my gift to you this evening. And the first handout, and we can get into it. You can ask me any questions. My main point about the lower house, the House of Representatives, which is 480 seats, my main point is that it has a feature which is, for the most part, most seats are elected in single-member districts. So this is just like this country or United Kingdom. In other words, this is a seat per district. It tends to advantage larger parties like the Democrats and Republicans. It tends to beat out third parties, smaller parties, and this tends to lead to a 2-party system. And then you also have 180 seats, which is more proportionally represented, which we can get into later. The upper house, I'll not even spend that much time on. The main message I have, and you can ask me questions if you like, is that upper house is more proportional. So in other words, upper house really does not have a feature which would lead to a 2-party system. And so, again, elections take place, as you can see on the first page of the handout. We've had 10 national level elections since the early 2000s. So 10 national level elections. And prime ministers typically have to resign before or after elections, depending on the electoral results. That's sort of been the pattern. So 10 national level elections and 7 prime ministers. So that's sort of a starting point that I wanted to give. Okay. A couple of other features, maybe one feature that I would emphasize. So if you look at what happens to LDP's vote, 2009, which was the sort of disastrous election for the LDP, in a single member district, and in 2012, the most recent lower house election, what you see is that the LDP vote actually went up by, let's say, about 4%, from, let's say, 39% to 43%. But that translated into, let's say, 180 seats or so. So this is a very typical feature of a single member district. UK is a very good example, in which, let's say, something like 40% of the vote can actually give you 60% of the seats. And that's been repeated, for example, in terms of what happened to Thatcher in the 80s, what happened to Blair in the 2000s, and so on. Okay, so that's sort of one feature that we can get back to. So what I want to do now is to talk, for the most part, about, the main point I wanted to give is that because of institutions, because of this institutional setup, the Japanese prime ministers have very short time horizons. That, as you can see in the elections, they have, let's say, if they're lucky, they have 2 years. Oftentimes they have a year and a half, and they kind of know that another election is coming. And this then makes it very difficult for Japanese prime ministers to have political stability in order to implement sort of long-term economic structural reforms or their own ideological visions. And again, I would argue that this is an institutional feature of Japanese democracy which is very distinctive, and it should be sort of known more to the outside world. Now, on to the ideological ambition. So if you look at page 2 and 3 of the handout, what I did here was to basically list what I think are the most important domestic policy development and foreign policy development. Again, we can read through them, you can let me know if you have any questions. So I would argue that for Koizumi, his ideological ambition was economic liberalism, neoliberalism. And so this is what he said, reform without sanctuary, seiki naki kaikaku. And this ideology came from his determination to destroy the Tanaka faction within the LDP and to transform the LDP. So what's distinctive about Koizumi is that LDP had declined beginning sometime in the 80s and 90s. And the LDP survived in the 2000s primarily because of his personal popularity. And he despised, he hated what was called the Tanaka faction, what it represented. It represented clientelism, that is, exchange of votes for particular benefits. It meant factionalism, so faction leaders control political parties. So it's a very distinctive strategy in the sense that he kept on winning elections. Well, not kept on, but for the most part, he was pretty good at winning elections. By saying that in order to change Japan, you have to change LDP, and he's the right man to do it. And so that's his political motivation, but his economic neoliberalism came from things like, for example, privatization, so privatization of special public corporations like Japan Highway Corporation, most famously privatization of the postal system and establishment of Japan Post, which took place a few years later. And also, a very important institution, Council on Fiscal Policy, which he's pictured here with a prominent minister and economist, Heizo Takenaka, which controlled and centralized the budgetary and fiscal policy making, which used to be very decentralized, which then kind of fed pork barrel politics that the LDP depended on. And so for Koizumi, it's very idiosyncratic. How can you convince the voters that somehow postal privatization is the solution to Japan's economic revival? Somehow he did in September 2005. We can get back to that. But again, it's idiosyncratic, but that was his personal conviction that he had. And if there's one thing, we can talk about US-Japan alliance, we can talk about Bush Koizumi, but there's one thing, this was his ideological conviction in which he could say, there you go, I did that as prime minister. So that, I would argue, is the ideological conviction of Koizumi. And again, that's, I think, very important in thinking about sort of where current Prime Minister Abe came from. Now, when Yukio Hatoyama became Prime Minister in August of 2009, as I mentioned, this was the largest margin of victory for any political party in post-war Japan. 308 seats. And this was, in many ways, what voters perceived as incompetence of the LDP, which they thought were represented by current Prime Minister Abe and current Deputy Prime Minister Aso. What's key here is that with this new majority in the lower house, and also his political capital, his significant political capital, very exciting moment, you may remember, that Japan for the first time, an opposition party won a majority of seats. But what's very important is that Hatoyama decided to use this political capital for his ideological purposes. And so I would argue that it consisted of, and I guess this is on page 3, anti-bureaucratic ideology. The other one is known as the term politicians-led or seijishudo process. But what's very distinctive about the moment that Hatoyama and the EPJ came into power is they said the solution to Japan's problem is to exclude the bureaucrats in the policy-making process. And again, that from a rational perspective, it's somewhat understandable in the sense that they have not been in power for a long time. But this was a particular political decision that he made in terms of trying to, in their view, make policy-making dominated by politicians, and oftentimes to exclude bureaucrats from the policy-making process. He himself would deny that he is anti-American. You could be the judge of that. You could read his New York Times article in, I think it was August 30th, 2009, when he came to power, in which he, there are phrases like market fundamentalism and the end of the US-led globalization, which, certainly gives some impression of that. But with his political capital, what he decided to spend his political capital energy on is the Futenma marine air station issue. Now, Futenma, US and Japan, I think, agree, is politically unsustainable. But they had agreed on what's called the roadmap in 2006. And so with this political capital, when voters said we want better living standards, the time and energy he decided to spend on was on this Futenma issue, which he actually has cared about. He's written a lot about this in the 2000s. But again, this was his ideological conviction. He said, I'm going to change this, and I'm going to be a prime minister who's going to change this. And this led to some problems in the US-China relations. We can get back to that. Now, finally, to Abe. So how should we think about Abe's political ideology? How should we think about his ideological ambition? So in his first term, the term, and this is actually on page 2, I suppose, in 0607, the term that you often heard was this term breaking away from the post-war regime. So Sengo regimeからの脱却. So Abe comes from this, has a conviction which has existed since the 1950s, that the Constitution of 1947 was imposed on Japan by US occupation authorities, that it is unnatural, that Japan in some ways has tread this unnatural path, and the Japanese themselves have to make this new constitution. And in general, I would argue that, again, this is a conservative political thought, which has existed at least since 1950s, probably earlier, that you have to, in post-war Japan, you have to enhance and redeem and resurrect state power. So for me, political conservatism in Japan has always been about state power. And this is reflected in a variety of policy issues that we can get back to. So in 06, 07, there was revision of fundamental law of education, which said that should be instilling of public-oriented spirit, and other issues that we can come back to, like upgrading of Ministry of Defense from Japan Defense Agency and so on. So, but what's different about the second term? I think what's different about the second term is that when he had to resign in 2007, and he was in a political wilderness, and basically, I think very few people would have believed, I wouldn't have believed that he would actually come back and become prime minister again, let alone 5 years later. And in the political wilderness, first until 2009, then being in opposition, is that I think he developed two sets of ideas. One is that in order for Japan to be respected in the international system, that Japan has to be a growing, vibrant economy again. That's the first conviction. The second conviction, I think, is that in order for him to realize his ideological ambition, this is not a project that takes a year or 2 years. This is a project that takes several years. The constitutional revision is a very big deal. That he needs to stay in power, and he needs to make sure that he stays focused on the economy in order to realize in the long run his ideological ambition of, most importantly, constitutional revision, which he's talked about a lot. And so I think my time is more or less up. So I could talk more about constitutional revision if you like. But I'll end by saying that we all know more or less he now has 3 more years. He focused on winning the upper house election in July of this year. He won the election. The LDP won the election. And so he now has until 2016. We don't know what will happen in 2016. Around that time is when both the lower house needs to have an election within 4 years of 2012. And then upper house, you know the timing is every 3 years in July. And so the key question basically for him, I think, is that I still believe personally that he wants to be the great prime minister. That he wants to be this great prime minister, which, as he calls it himself, sort of let Japan move away from what he called the post-war regime. So the question is, what would happen to the economy? That's the question. And then what would happen to the voters' perceptions about the prime minister's focus and how that is shaping their moves. So I'll end it.
Thank you very much. And next finally we have Professor Kundera from the Religion Department at Wellesley speaking on nationalism.
Resurgence of.
Resurgence of.
Yeah. The best is over, so feel free to leave. I did not have any specific preparation because I had no idea what our guest speakers were going to say. And as an in-house speaker from within this campus and coming from an entirely different field of inquiry, I thought that I should wait until I heard 2 speakers. So I think I have a much better idea now, thanks to you, of what I'm going to say. 15 minutes, and I'm going to spend 5 minutes on the following 3 points. At the outset, I should say that my perspective is intentionally macroscopic rather than microscopic. And my perspective is also from the standpoint of a historian of religion, dealing with Asia in its broadest of scopes, including India, China, Korea, and Japan, and further West Asia. So that's where I'm coming from. And I'm going to make statements that are meant to be evocative, if not provocative. So what I'm going to say is not just descriptive and safe and point of view, but I want to make 3 observations that are meant to be evocative, if not also provocative. One, in the broadest of strokes, history of Japan, with primary emphasis on culture and society, not so much on politics and economics, is that Japan always found itself an isolated place. It's an ideology of an island country. In that sense, Japan shares much in common with the United Kingdom, which is also an island country. Not only that, Japan has always felt inferiority complex toward the civilizations of the Asian continent, especially toward India and China, and somewhat to a lesser extent toward Korea. So when Japan was finally connected to the Asian mainland through Buddhism during the 6th century, that gave the Japanese a perfect opportunity to become connected to Asia, with India and China as the two foci. And yet at the same time, Japan had to maintain its own independence, its own uniqueness. And the way they did that was to combine Chinese Buddhism, which was brought not by the Chinese but by the Koreans, something that the Japanese even today are quite reluctant to admit. But Korea was clearly the conduit for the arrival of Buddhism to Japan. Since the 6th century, ever since Buddhism became part of Japan, the Japanese had to find ways to maintain its independence, uniqueness, and eventually somehow prove Japan to be not only an equal of China, Korea, and India, but somehow superior. And I want to cite one example of what they did. Upon learning that the founder of Buddhism and the founding figure of Confucianism lived in the 6th century BCE, they made the effort to revise Shintoism in such a way as to make it starting with the 6th century BCE. If you look at the official genealogy of the emperors of Japan, the first emperor, Emperor Jimmu, is said to have lived in the 6th century BCE, although there is no evidence for that at all. The first emperor of Japan, whose historicity can be proven both by documentary evidence and archaeological evidence, is Emperor Nintoku, who lived around the 2nd century or 3rd century CE. So that span of 8 centuries, they have a genealogy of emperors, but in my opinion, these are all fictional emperors, including Emperor Jimmu. Okay? The reason why they created the history of Shintoism as beginning in the 6th century BCE is to make Shintoism, to make the imperial heritage, to make the culture of Japan as old as Buddhist India and Confucian China. Okay, now I told you I was going to make an evocative, provocative statement. Okay. My second point, 1868, when the power to rule Japan was transferred back from the feudal lords, the Tokugawa clan, to the Meiji Emperor, 1868. On the surface, it was the year in which Japan